Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting part 2 of an exciting new series. What if Genius Deku challenged the world without a quirk? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by JayDeeKay on archiveofourown.org. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. The sound of a hammer pounding against metal echoes from the garage of the Midoriya house, echoing out of the holes in the garage door into the neighborhood, much to the dismay of the residents. However, the source of the noise cared little about this disturbance, his mind far more focused on his current objective. Izuku pounded away at the rolled brass sheets, bending them around a plastic mold to the best of his ability. The hammer struck steadily, and Izuku stared at the plate as it shaped around the curve of the plastic facsimile. He was glad his father had invested in a cast printer before his death. Even if the model was a bit old, it had saved him potentially weeks of time shaping the mold for the plating, even if that part wasn't top priority. His arm began to ache, but he kept hammering the plate. There was no time to waste and absolutely no room for error. If even the smallest calculation is off the mark, it could spell disaster down the road, especially when it comes to this new project. Using a mounted C-clamp to hold the mold in place was not the best for control, but given his options, it would have to do. Izuku sighed and wiped the sweat off his brow, looking back at the schematics he had drawn. The loss of his dominant hand had meant that drafting was a near nightmare, but luckily, the only person that needed to understand the scribbles and rambling written onto their pages was him. He double-checked the measurements of the digits. Those scans he uploaded to the casting computer are reliable, but not necessarily the most accurate in terms of measurements. Right now, Izuku needed precision, so he had also done several checks by hand. The diagram was crude, but detailed, with several notes of internal and external measurements. The greatest challenge would be internal spacing and management of wiring along the internal skeleton. There was only so much space to work with, only so much material available, and every time he thought more closely about the project as a whole, the more daunting it seemed. This was easily the most complex project he had ever made, far more advanced than anything that had come before it. It would be incredibly difficult, and worse, Izuku was on a clock. 10 months. 10 months until the UA entrance exam. This was his shoe-in, his golden ticket. It may be hard for him to pull it off. It may be the most difficult endeavor in his life. But it wasn't impossible. The theory was sound. It had simply never been done before. But there was always a first time for everything. And he had made a promise. He had something to prove, and the first step to proving that was beating out anyone he needed to get into the support course. From there, he had a bigger goal in mind. Izuku had far more free time available to him now. With his new disability and having finally withdrawn from Aldera, instead enrolling in an online school, he was able to focus all of his attention on his magnum opus. It was actually quite easy to withdraw. The teachers were clearly glad to be rid of the quirkless freak. Maybe they had even assumed he had given up. But ultimately, he still had to graduate middle school to get into UA, though he can't pretend school was ever all that difficult to him. Classes always came easy to him. However, he had always had to underperform in order to avoid more abuse from his teachers and classmates. Wouldn't want the defect to show up all the students with promise. Izuku thought bitterly. But in an online setting, he could easily deflect his quirk status if it ever came up. He simply did not tell the instructors, and his classmates barely even knew he existed. It was perfect. Izuku let his thoughts grow stormy, frustration bubbling within. Yes, all it took for him to be treated like a normal human being was for him to withdraw himself from life, living as a recluse and operating solely from the safety and anonymity of the internet. That sure seemed fair. He sighed, getting back to his work. Life had never been fair. He had just been too blind to see it at first, still holding out hope for a better world tomorrow, that maybe things would get better. No man is born equal. Izuku looked down at his stunted shoulder, the vacancy of his right arm causing him to feel a phantom tingling of sensation in his missing fingers. Some people are born strong, with the whole world simply available to them from the very start. He stopped pounding the brass sheet into shape, moving over to the skeleton apparatus. Everyone else is left to wallow in mediocrity. Their worth decided for them by those at the top. The sheet fitted perfectly into the bicep portion of the skeleton, and he stepped back to admire his handiwork. Instead of the small spark of pride he usually felt when he finished another step in his projects, all he felt was a burning determination to keep going, to finish this project. He smirked to himself, a fire once nearly extinguished burning violently behind his irises. But what is so great about being born great? I much prefer to make myself even greater. Izuku looks back at the diagram, preparing himself for the next step. On the blueprint, a rough drawing of a right arm stares right back at him. With the outer shell complete, it is time to craft the inner mechanism of the prosthesis. Izuku spoke calmly into the lapel microphone clipped to his shirt. Something about the dictation process brought some calm to him, a relaxing sense of familiarity washing through him. This will likely be the most time-consuming and experimental part of Experiment 573, as there isn't much actionable data to work with available. He laughed to himself. I suppose that is what you get for breaking the proverbial mold, but somebody had to do it. He moved over to the corner of the garage, where a small object mounted to a table was threading copper wiring together. Power supply will likely be an issue. To articulate movement at a direct match to a real arm will likely take high-gauge wiring, especially if we want to avoid input delay. Calling back to Experiment 572, high-gauge wires like the ones used there should hopefully be sufficient. He looks back to the shell, sitting on a stand near the computer, before bringing his hand to his forehead and massaging his brow. Space is my greatest enemy right now. Besides time, he measured the internal space of the shell again, as if hoping that the data would magically change. But to nobody's shock, the values gathered were exactly the same. The internal cavity, including the endoskeleton, is simply not large enough to fit all this wiring. Though maybe he opened the shell, observing the internal axle of the arm. Maybe there is a way I can avoid using an internal pillar structure and replace it with a cage-like structure. He moved to the welding bench, pulling out pieces of scrap brass and lowering his welding mask. This could work, though it also could not. Another wasted day if so. He looked towards the calendar on the wall. 9 months left. Igniting the torch, he began to change ideas to reality. Suppose there is only one way to find out. Test 32 of internal wiring structure. Izuku said, exhausted. He had been at this for the past 3 days. Testing the wiring for data input was a taxing process, especially when it didn't work. 2 hours of ripping the wiring out. 4 hours of rethreading new wires. 1 hour of coding the new wires to avoid short circuits. 6 hours of relaying the wires within the shell again. Though with the new internal cage structure of the internal support, there was a lot more room available to him within the design, meaning he had some room for error. However, every gauge he has tested so far simply isn't enough. It does not supply power nearly as readily as he needs to. The first 6 tests had gleaned no response. It wasn't until the 8th test that he had managed to get one of the fingers to twitch. Though the cosmic insult of that finger, being the middle one, was not lost on him. 5 days of testing, and all he had managed to get was for the arm to flip him off. Wonderful. He had actually managed to get the fist to close on test 25, although the movement quickly began to stutter, and any meaningful response was relegated to impotent spasms. In short, the mechanism still wasn't getting enough power. Theoretically, he could just rapidly increase the wire gauge until it finally works, then work back, but by doing so there was a good chance that the entire process would simply take longer. He would simply have to make do with this method. Once again, the internal mechanism can only open and close the fist. The programming of more dynamic movement would come once the power supply issue is resolved. Izuku wiped more sweat off his brow. Summer had come with a vengeance this year, and in the relatively exposed and uncooled garage, the summer heat was blistering, but he carried on. There was no time to waste on fatigue. He could rest when the problem was solved. Izuku turned back to the arm, preparing the switch connected to the arc blue nexus. He was lucky that when 572 ignited, the actual power supply remained relatively unharmed. The leather he had used for the straps simply was not capable of handling the heat of a continuous blast. Instead, this time, he had a plan that would hopefully avoid that problem. Izuku sighed, muttering a short prayer to himself, before locking his eyes on the metal hand on his desk. "All right, you hunk of metal," Izuku muttered, "this better fucking work." With no more delay, Izuku flipped the switch. hearing the hum of the apparatus as power fed into the arm. At first, there was no reaction, and Izuku had wondered if he had maybe missed a socket. However, after about 10 seconds, the false hand twitched before clamping shut violently. Izuku stared in awe as the fist then began to slowly open, blossoming like a flower, before slowly closing back up again. He simply sat, stunned as the hand began to perform this simple grasping motion. But his attention snapped over to the display connected to the Nexus, a simple power reading. The power supply remained steady, hovering to 99% supply before shooting back to 100%. With the unique design of the apparatus, a small fraction of the power produced was fed back into the supply to therefore produce more power, a hopefully infinite cycle of production. So long as the power consumption does not exceed the supply rate at least. Izuku smiled, a light chuckle escaping his lips before he could quell the urge. Nervously, he pressed the button on the lapel mic and continued the dictation. T-test. He takes a deep breath, composing himself. Test 32 appears to be successful at allowing for substantial movement of the digits. He looks back over to the power supply, noting the display has not changed. Power supply is holding steady as the machine operates. Proof of concept is positive. He felt tears begin to stream down his face, his voice growing husky with emotion. This could work. This could really actually work. Izuku fitted the neural apparatus to the crown of his head, the apparatus sitting on his brow, 2 sensors pressed against his skull, directly over his primary motor cortex. He looked over at the calendar, still hanging in the corner of his room. 5 months left. Progress had been quick since his last major leap forward. The wire gauge had been sufficient at allowing for more dynamic movements. He had tested with waving, finger fluttering, twisting of the wrist, and even some simple sign language. Power still remained strong for the arm. So strong he had considered what he could do to add more function to the prosthesis. Though, that thought remains far on the back burner. For now, he can't simply rely on simple programs. That would just be a bionic arm that operates on preset commands. Maybe sufficient in the short term, but ultimately a far cry from his intended goal. He wanted to go even further than anyone else had managed before. But in order to do that, he actually had to get it to move through neural input. However, before he did anything more invasive, he needed a proof of concept, something to show him it could even work like that in the first place. For now, a neural input wreath and a wireless receiver plugged into the direct port of the arm will have to do, even if the input delay will be awful. Beginning test 63 of neural input, Izuku said, turning the wreath on and connecting it to the wireless receiver. It is noted the potential input delay of the neural receiver is anywhere between 2.3 and 12.5 seconds for intention to translate to action. Izuku looked at the display, noting that the wreath was reading brain activity at only 78% capacity. With the limited capability of neural sensors, the input will already be weak, though after this we will attempt a direct connection to the arm from the wreath. The final design will be a lot more direct. Izuku felt himself shudder slightly, thinking about the final plan, but shook himself out of his discomfort. He would do this. He would make this work by any means necessary. Focusing his attention on the arm, Izuku tried to force the arm to move one finger. A simple action to test the connection, and as with the last 2 tests, after a short delay, the pointer finger unfurls from the fist and points straight forward. Izuku focused on the pinky, attempting to move that the same way, and following the example of the larger finger, the pinky moves in the same way, this time after a slightly longer delay. Izuku sighed, taking a deep breath, and began the next test. Moving multiple fingers at the same time, he willed the hand to move all fingers out, matching the pinky and pointer. This time it took nearly a minute, but all of the fingers began to move outward. However, he noticed the pinky and pointer also attempting to move up, straining the knuckle joints, and causing one of the tension springs to snap. Panicking, he tried to force the arm to stop, rushing forward to grab it with his own hand. However, this only seemed to cause the arm to snap out, ripping all of the joints and warping the springs on the palm side of the digits. Quickly, Izuku ripped the wreath off and hit the emergency stop, and the arm stalled, the fingers resting at odd, unnatural angles, as if every finger had been broken at once. Frustration began to boil in him. The past 30 tests had all been exactly the same, and all it led to was lost time as he fixed the damn things back into place. He felt anger overtake him for a moment, clouding his judgment as he took the nearest object and throwing it across the room. It took him a moment to realize that object happened to be the wreath, and he watched as it slammed into the back wall of the garage, breaking against it. It took Izuku a moment to calm down enough to realize what he had just done, knowing now that that would take even more time to fix that problem, on top of everything else he had to fix. So much lost time, so much wasted material. It all collapsed on him at once. It felt like a spring snapped in his mind, and he began to scream out in frustration, pounding his fist into the ground as he simply crumpled, letting his rage pour out, as well as tears. It wasn't enough. 5 months wasn't enough. Maybe this really was impossible after all. Maybe if he had had a quirk, then it would have worked. Before Izuku could let himself grovel any more in his emotions, he felt a spike of pain flare up along his right shoulder. What once was new and terrifying was far more familiar than he had wished. It felt as if his right arm had just grown back, only to be crushed and detonated once again. Phantom pains. Dr. Chikafuji had explained that this was something that was possible, especially with how traumatic his injury was. And it was likely that he would deal with this unique cocktail of pain for the rest of his life. He clenched his stump tightly, as if putting pressure on it would stem this intangible wound, but it did nothing. He stumbled through the door into his house and over to the kitchen cabinets, reaching in and grabbing an injector from the medicine drawer. Chikafuji prescribed him high-grade painkillers for his attacks, something that he had broken into very early on. Placing the concealed needle over his collarbone, aiming for the gap between his bones, he pressed the plunger, feeling the surprisingly long needle shoot out into his arm, before injecting the contents into his stump. He immediately felt the pain ebb, as well as an all-too-familiar sense of lethargy wash over him, calming his mind. He hated this. He looked down at his stump again, feeling a sense of loathing wash over him. If only he were stronger. If only he had been strong enough to fight back then. If only he weren't born wrong. Then none of this would have happened in the first place. He wanted to cry, to scream, to thrash and sob at how much his life had failed him, how much his own body had failed him. If only he were strong like everyone else. But isn't that why you're doing this in the first place? He stilled at that thought, lying on the floor of his kitchen, staring at the ceiling. Isn't all of this trial and error, all of this pain, to prove to them all that you are strong? Izuku doesn't answer his mental question, letting his breathing calm down. Or maybe it isn't to prove it to them. Izuku stands up, any exhaustion leaving his body, as he begins to slowly stumble back to the garage. Maybe this is to prove it to yourself. Moving over to the broken remains of the wreath, he took a deep breath and sat down at the soldering booth. He had a lot of work to do and no time to waste. Test 95 of neural input, Izuku says, yawning as the light of the dawn peeks through the singed hole in the garage door. Another all-nighter, it would seem. No matter, he would sleep when this was done, or when he passed out next. Whichever comes first. We disposed of the wireless connection to the arm, and instead have opted for a direct wired connection to the primary motor function of the input port. This should offer a more accurate ability to assess neural information input at the cost of longer setup time. He looks down at the arm, the new digits carefully reassembled. In addition, I installed brackets onto the outer joints of the digits, which will hopefully prevent stressing on the springs. He yawns again, lifting the wreath back onto his crown and trying to focus his tired mind on the arm again. Single-digit movement has been confirmed already, so we will skip that, moving directly to the multiple-digit phase. He takes a deep breath, massaging the bags from under his eyes. For now, I think 3 digits will suffice for a test. Izuku follows his mental command, willing the middle 3 fingers to extend. About 4 seconds later, the digits extend, with the pinky and thumb remaining curled. Izuku felt an excitement bubble in him, but quelled it. Good start, but no need to get overwhelmed. Initial test successful. Now to attempt more complex movement. For now, a hand wave would suffice. Izuku then stood up, moving closer to the emergency stop just in case, before attempting his new command. At first, there is no movement. Then after about 10 seconds, the arm begins to twitch, fingers extending and fanning out before the wrist moves side to side with slow, deliberate movements. Izuku could feel his heart hammering in his chest. This was good, this was very good. But now the most nerve-wracking test. With dynamic movement a success, it is time to move on to stress testing. Izuku wiped sweat off his brow. The summer heat, having faded about a month ago, and nervousness being the only explanation of this perspiration. In order to be considered a success, the arm needs to survive exertion. It wouldn't do for it to break down every other day. It needs to be reliable. Any exhaustion has faded from Izuku, replaced with stress and determination. He then willed the fingers to move back as far as they possibly can go, stretching the false fingers out and up. He hears the sounds of the servos moving, the springs extending and contracting, and holds position. He then wills the wrist to rotate in a stunted circle, mimicking the natural rotation of a flesh wrist. He repeated this action for about 10 minutes, every second seeming to drag on an eon. But after the timer goes off, Izuku relaxes and switches the wreath off. Approaching the arm, he opens the panels on the digits, checking the brackets and springs for any signs of stress. Apart from some minor abrasions to the brackets, and some very minimal warping to the springs, the digits retain functionality. Izuku let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, his shoulders slumping as he spoke into the microphone again. Stress testing indicates some slight warping to structural and actionable parts, though well within parameters. It may be advisable to make the springs thicker and replace the brackets with something that can keep its shape easier. Though, Izuku yawns again, adrenaline leaving his body, and a feeling of drowsiness rapidly robbing him of motor function. Though I would call Test 95 a success, he barely manages to get the final word out before he collapses onto the floor of the garage unconscious. Izuku stood in front of the corkboard where his schematics lay, pondering the various designs that sat displayed before him. For the first time in a while, he was at a loss of how to proceed. He had several ideas of how to integrate a neural sensor into the arm itself for a more direct attachment, theoretically mitigating or even removing input delay altogether. These range from a simple fishbowl sensor on the shoulder joint to a direct neural link fed through the shoulder and to the arm. And theoretically, all of the ideas were sound. But that was the problem. Theoretically, there really wasn't any way to test these ideas before making changes to the design and to himself, changes he would not be able to reverse once made. He wasn't one to take risks when they weren't necessary. And although the delay on the neural wreath is atrocious, the design is sound and the prosthesis functions. He could take that design and run with it, trying his best to reduce delay as much as possible. He could get it close, very close, but for some reason, the idea of doing that left a sour taste in his mouth. 7 months of work, and he was going to settle for almost perfect? No, that didn't sit right, that didn't feel right. Here 2 options presented themselves, both of which would leave the design as perfect as it possibly could be. And he was beginning to have second thoughts? He was just being a coward. He always knew this was a possibility, that when it came to taking that final leap, he might have to do something drastic. But such a procedure could have complications. Best case? He has a connection with no input delay. Worst case? He didn't really want to think about the worst case. He looked back to the 2 ideas. The sensor would be more complex. It would take longer, but in the long run it would allow for better flexibility and more ease of repair and modular attachments. However, the second option is quicker and theoretically has a simpler connection setup, though it is far more permanent, something he would likely have to correct down the line. He looked at the calendar. He didn't have a lot of time, let alone for recovery, but there was only one real option. Option Gamma provides a far more complex design, but for future upgrades and repairs provides the best design to fix problems. We'll go with that. He looked over at the computer chair at the main desk, his dictation writing out as he goes. He swallows roughly before shaking his head and resolving himself. Let's begin preparations for the operation. A week of shifting desks and changing the layout of the workshop, and Izuku had rigged a makeshift cot in the center of the lab, attaching a robotic arm to the ground near it, and leather straps attached to the side of the chair, and a bite bar angled right above where his head would be. Izuku looked at the setup with a sinking dread. He took a deep breath and stripped off his shirt. He looked down to his right, the bandages still wrapped around his stump, and began to unwrap them. He didn't need to wear them anymore, but every time he looked at the exposed stump, he felt this sinking feeling of inadequacy and self-loathing. The scarred, stunted limb filling his mind with dark thoughts he would rather avoid. However, this time, looking down at the stump, all he felt was the familiar feeling that he gets when a new idea invades his mind. I need to fix a problem. He took several deep breaths, staring at the cot with extreme dread. Looking over at the other table, he saw 4 of the painkiller hypos laid out, ready just in case. Everything is prepared, everything is ready. But is he? It isn't too late to back out, to try something else before he makes a mistake, an error that could have devastating consequences. But if he gave up now, would he ever really forgive himself? No, he wouldn't. Izuku marched over to the cot, laying himself down, and using a joystick to control the robot arm. The arm lifts the straps and buckles them, restraining Izuku tightly. He couldn't be allowed to move much. He had to remain perfectly still through the entire procedure. Once the straps were in place, Izuku slowly used the joystick to lift the metal object from the desk, his heart beginning to hammer into his chest. The object was a fitted metal plate, molded to a pauldron-like shape. It was simple, save for the currently exposed arc blue power supply fitted into a compartment into the plate. On the outside of the pauldron, near the joint, is a glossy black glass semicircle, a fisheye lens fitted to a sensor just under the glass. The plates were moved out of the way to expose both the power supply and the sensor, with notches to attach to the arm. At the edges of the shoulder joint were 4 sockets, each fitted to extend about 4 inches into the shoulder, with 4 steel bolted screws attached to them. Under the sensor was a large drill bit, with wiring spiraling loosely down. Izuku moved the shoulder plate into position, fitting it tightly against his stump. He took several more deep breaths before turning the dictation back on. What I'm about to do will be permanent. Once it's on, there is no going back. Izuku spoke into the dictation, shivering as he looked over at the hauntingly large drill bit. But if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. I have a score to settle, a point to prove. He took a deep breath, looking over to the drill bit poised directly over his stump shoulder joint, and flicked the power on. The drill began to spin, and with that active, he let go of the joystick and initiated the automatic procedure programming, letting the computer take care of the rest. His breathing became shallow as the drill bit approached his scarred flesh, and after several agonizing moments of anticipation, the metal met his stunted joint. The first thing he felt was the unimaginable pain of the drill meeting his bone. He immediately bit down on the bite bar, clenching his jaw tightly on the piece of metal. The drill went further and further, penetrating the fresh bone cap and entering the marrow within. The pain flared even worse, permeating through his every being, and he began to thrash and whirl within the straps. The drill continued on, undaunted by Izuku's wails of pain. Eventually, the base of the drill hit his skin, and the drill stopped. With that, the next phase began. He felt more than saw the wires wrapped around the drill bit begin to unfurl, small drill caps of their own, beginning to dig into the muscle and flesh around his arm. Somehow, if possible, the snaking of these automatic wires squirming through his flesh hurt even more. He felt his consciousness begin to fade, and could hear the alert that his heart rate is at a dangerous level. He can feel the drilling slow as the procedure begins to abort, but Izuku lets go of the bite bar. Override emergency stop. Do not stop now. Now when we are so close. He grips the bite bar with his mouth, as the drills begin to speed up again, snaking to meet his axillary and radial nerves. I'm not done. I'm not done yet. The wires meet the caps of his nerves, embedding themselves into him. The cacophony of agony he had been feeling now embraces a new tune, this one a shooting and debilitating nausea. The wires, after embedding themselves into his axillary, radial, and musculocutaneous nerve, burn themselves into the nerve cells, cauterizing the wounds and permanently attaching themselves to his body. The tears overwhelmed his vision. He could barely breathe. He could feel his mind swim with nausea and exhaustion, but he willed himself to keep from passing out. The final stretch was here, one step left. With the signal that the nerve wires had fully integrated with his nervous system, the 4 screws on the edges of the shoulder harness began to spin, quickly moving down into the flesh of his outer shoulder, twisting themselves into his flesh and embedding themselves 4 inches into his shoulder. At this point, the pain was simply an incomprehensible menagerie of numbness, his mind rejecting the sensations of the bolts as they twist themselves into place, tightening the shoulder harness into his flesh and pressing the cool metal onto his skin. With a final sound like a camera flash, the surface of the bolts and shoulder plate release a white-hot flash that sears the metal into his skin, burning the brass into his hypodermis and anchoring the harness with the bolts. With that, the arm unbuckles the leather straps. Izuku is barely conscious at this point, but he falls out of the chair, knocking himself to the floor as the smell of burning skin and hair wafts into his nostrils. He drags himself over to the painkillers, drunkenly groping at the air, hoping that his random motions manages to grab even just one. Anything to escape the agony that he had just endured. In his weak meandering, he knocks one of the hypos to the ground, the plastic hypo falling in front of him. He weakly grasps the painkiller before lifting it to his shoulder, placing the lip at the exposed skin just next to the new shoulder harness, and pressing the plunger, injecting himself with the painkiller. The agony numbs slightly, still throbbing in his shoulder and collarbone, but the exhaustion of the ordeal catches up with him, and he feels consciousness slip away, darkness embracing him. Izuku wakes in a puddle of sweat and loose scrap metal. Immediately, he notices that the light has faded outside. It is nighttime. The pain begins to flare up again, and he grabs another hypo, injecting himself with the fluid and numbing the pain. He slowly lifts himself up, using the table as a makeshift crutch, before looking over at his shoulder. The glossy brass shoulder cap sits fitted into his shoulder, the power supply still exposed, and he moves over to the arm laying on his desk. He lifts the arm to his shoulder harness, lining his hooks up to the harness and locking it in place. He then lifts a plug from the arm, pushing it up to the power supply installed in his new shoulder harness. Moment of truth. Izuku says, straining against the burning pain in his arm and the exhaustion from the painkillers. He slowly connects the arm to the power supply. Immediately, a soft humming begins to sound as plates begin to lock into place. Plates cover the power supply and then move down over the hooks, further securing the arm into place. A whirring sound begins to resonate through the arm, and Izuku looks at the invention with anticipation and a desperate hope. Izuku's heart is pounding in his ears, the thumping of the drumbeat of his circadian rhythm echoing through his brain as he wants the arm to move. Immediately, as if not connected with a sensor, the arm begins to move, curling upward with no delay. He extends the arm, twisting it out and spreading his fingers, thrumming them against the air before moving them in a wave pattern and clenching his new arm into a fist. Izuku begins to cry, sobs of joy echoing along the walls of the garage. He lets his emotions completely consume him, allowing himself to succumb to them for the first time in months. After his sobs began to dissipate, he looked over at the calendar. 1 month left before the exam. Looking down at his new arm, for the first time in nearly a year, he finally felt whole. He could do this. He would do this. And nobody was going to stop him. Not anymore. The morning of the entrance exam was cold. Not unsurprising for February, but since his injury, Izuku had always found the cold just that much more unbearable. His stump throbbed with a muted aching as he awoke to the alarm next to his bed, the slight chill of his open window stinging his face. He had a feeling this might happen, but unfortunately opening his window slightly was the only way to escape the unbearable heat that came whenever he shut his eyes. The nightmares had gotten significantly worse as time went on. He tried not to think about them. Dwelling on figments of his imagination wouldn't get him anywhere, and he didn't need them distracting him today. He lifted himself out of his bed, shaking off the remnants of the nightmare. An unbearable heat descending on him, searing his flesh and destroying his body, slowly, savoring every moment of his screams. Stop it, he thought. Don't think about it. Just focus on the next step, one step at a time. He breathed deeply, rising off his bed and moving over to the corner of his bedroom, the barren walls reflecting back onto him, the floors cluttered with gadgets and half-finished projects. Grabbing his new arm and holding it up to the shoulder harness, he felt the plates move aside and expose the hooks within. Hooking the arm into place, he felt the fake limbs snap on, a software as power flooded through the connection as the metal fingers began to twitch. He made a fist with his metal arm, the limb responding immediately to follow his demand. He knows he should be proud, maybe even impressed, but as he moves the limb, he can't help but note all of the small imperfections littered across the limb. The hand press plating is a bit uneven. One of his fingers is maybe 1/4 of an inch too long. There is this irritating clicking sound every time he rotates the wrist clockwise, and it still can't feel anything. He sighs, moving over to his closet and grabbing some clothes, a sleeveless shirt, some cargo pants, and boots. The arm isn't perfect, but I didn't exactly have the time to iron out all of the kinks. Slipping on the pants and shirt, he looks back down at his prosthesis. It works, and it works well. And for now, that will have to be enough. He nods to himself, walking down the stairs and slipping on a jacket and stopping at the door. His heart begins to hammer again, and he holds up his slip for the entrance exam. I can do this. I will do this. He sets out the door, slipping his coat on and lowering the sleeve as far as possible on his prosthesis. He didn't want to get any stares on the train. The crowds gathered outside the entrance of UA is intimidating, and Izuku can feel his anxiety rising as more and more people pour in. He never understood why UA didn't stagger their exams for each course. This cannot be easy to manage. Though looking up at the massive facility, he supposed that they had the capacity to hold everyone. The Udota campus spans on, for visible practice cities and multiple training grounds present within eyesight. And with the entire thing protected by a massive, state-of-the-art wall and a staff of pro heroes, it had to be one of the most secure places he had ever been. Honestly, I don't know if that should be reassuring or concerning. Izuku took a deep breath, bracing himself for the clutter of bodies that is the front gate, and began to move forward. At first, it wasn't that bad, though he flinched a bit whenever somebody got too close to him or accidentally bumped into him. However, the closer he got, the faster his heart raced, and the shallower his breathing became. When he reached the apex of the cluster of support course hopefuls, his vision began to dart around at all of the people surrounding him. He could feel a ringing in his ears as he cataloged every face, every individual, every visible quirk, every threat. Trying to take deep breaths, he slowly reined in his anxiety, though it flared again when somebody bumped into him from the side, his body flinching violently, and his thoughts began to race, thinking of every way that he could possibly escape this situation, every route, every option. I need to get out of here. It isn't safe. His mind swam, his hearing deafened by the drumbeat of his racing heart. I shouldn't be here. I can't be here. Ease. Izuku's attention snapped back over to the present, noting the trench coat-wearing hero standing at the door, the dark blue mask covering his lipless face, looking at him with some level of confusion and boredom, directly in front of the door. Ectoplasm quirk clones. Oh, I'm at the front of the line. Izuku stammered out to the hero. I am sorry. Can you repeat that, please? He heard some stifled chuckling from behind him, somewhere, followed by whispering and no. Doubt pointed mocking. Ectoplasm simply sighed and repeated his question. Entrance slip and ID, please? Izuku nodded and quickly grabbed his ID and invitation slip and handed them over to Ectoplasm. The hero looked over the slip before nodding and comparing the information to that on his ID. However, Ectoplasm's gaze stuttered, and his eyes narrowed on the slip before he flipped the ID over and seemed to try and double-check. My quirk status, Izuku thought, his fear and anxiety slowly giving way for frustration. Of course he's surprised. No way a quirkless person could get into the exam fairly, right? Ectoplasm finally nodded, handing Izuku back his ID and entrance slip. Izuku noted with irritation the confused look on Ectoplasm's face as he handed Izuku a paper with directions to the support course written test. Izuku grabbed the paper and quickly made his way down the hall, not daring to look back and see the coat-wearing hero still looking at him with disbelief. Is it really that hard to believe that I worked hard to get here? Izuku thought bitterly. Or is it just hard for him to believe quirkless people still exist? He followed the map, nearly getting turned around a couple of times. The inner building was a labyrinth of hallways and stairs, twisting and turning in a chaotic harmony that threatened to swallow Izuku into its halls. Luckily for Izuku, there were small signs at the junctions of every hall, pointing the way to the support course section of the school. Eventually, he made his way down to the basement of the school, where multiple doors lined each hallway, each door decorated with a stylized H and a corresponding number. He notes at the end of the hall are 2 open doors and a large auditorium lined with desks, where a crowd seems to be gathering. Looking down at the map he was given, he notes his seat number and quickly enters the room, trying to locate his seat. The auditorium is fairly plain, though the lights are dimmed slightly, making it harder for him to locate his section. Looking around, he sees many prospective students meandering about the auditorium, some mingling among themselves, others doing some last-minute cramming for the exam. He took a deep breath, quelling the rising anxiety in his heart, before finally locating his seat and taking his place among the crowd. Looking down at his clothed right arm, Izuku twists his wrist again, hearing that same soft clicking sound emanating from his wrist when it spins, and grunts in frustration. The sound wasn't loud, but it was irritating, a problem he hadn't had time to fix. A job left unfinished. Looking at the clock, he noted there was about 10 minutes until the exam started. Slowly rolling up his sleeve, he looked around to see if anyone was looking his way, but the other occupants seemed to be focused on their own testing. So Izuku proceeded to tap the panel over the back of his hand, causing it to flip open and reveal the machinery underneath. He pulled out a small screwdriver he took from home and began to tighten the small screws that lined the inner ring of the wrist. Maybe the clicking sound is caused by a loose structural ring on the inner caging? Izuku theorized to himself, zoning out completely from everyone around him. If so, then if I tighten the screws here and here, it may fix that problem at least. Completing his task, Izuku lifts his screwdriver out of the arm and slowly rotates his wrist. He still feels some slight rhythmic resistance, and some soft clicking still persists, but the sound has gotten considerably softer, and the actual clicking is spaced much further apart. If I had more time, I would check the O-ring seal, but I only have a minute or 2 before the exam starts. All in all, this is considerably better. However, for future models, I might want to avoid this design altogether. Maybe a ball joint would be more seamless? Or maybe even a magnetic locking mechanism supporting a sphere in order to better simulate a wrist. The arm has some problems moving the hand up and down, so that would definitely dash. Did you build that? Izuku was startled from his mental ramblings by a voice coming from directly to the side of him. Turning, he flinches back when he notes a pair of yellow crosshair-shaped eyes staring at him, far too close for comfort. He leans away from his fellow student, but she only seems to lean in further. She has a manic smile on her face, and her hair is done in a messy pink dreadlocks and appears unwashed. Not that I'm one to talk, Izuku notes, thinking back to the months of barely showering when working on the arm. The girl's crosshair eyes narrow and spin, her pupil shrinking to an almost invisible pinpoint, similar to the diaphragm of a microscope, though she doesn't appear to be looking at his face, but rather the still open back panel of his false hand. Izuku yelps, drawing some annoyed glances from other candidates, before quickly shutting the panel on his hand. He looked back up at the girl, trying to calm the surprise and fear he felt, and spoke to her with mild annoyance. Don't you know it is rude to stare at people? Izuku spoke, confidence wilting as his stuttering returned. The girl did not seem to acknowledge what he said, instead reaching over and trying to touch his fake arm. He felt his fear begin to overtake his mind, but managed to keep calm, choosing to move his arm away from her, shielding it with his body. The girl finally looked up at his face, yellow crosshairs acknowledging his features, manic smile never leaving her face. You are interesting, she declares, holding out a hand for Izuku to shake. Tell me your name. I Izuku Midoriya? Izuku says, though phrasing it more like a question than anything. Midoriya, she states, testing the word. She wiggles her still extended hand, eyes still locked onto his own. He notes she extended her right hand for the handshake, hoping he shook with his mechanical arm. Likely another excuse for her to poke around at it, Izuku thinks, expression souring. Seems like she wants to know how it works, maybe even take the idea for herself. I don't need her poking around it. He turns away, facing forward and refusing to acknowledge her outstretched hand. Probably just try to use me like everyone else. The less she, or anyone else, knows about me or my arm, the better. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees her wilt a bit before lowering her arm and facing forward like him, and a small part of him feels bad and begins to string up an apology. But his mind stops that process before it can become anything. She wouldn't be so interested if she knew I was quirkless, he thought, pulling his pen and some spare papers out of his bag. It's better this way. I don't need anyone pretending to care about me. He pauses, trying to compose himself. A few deep breaths, and he schools his features once again. Besides, this way it will hurt less when they find out the truth. The lights finally turn dark before a spotlight shines on the stage, and a single figure walks out from behind a curtain. The figure that walks out is male, wearing no shirt and what appears to be a digger's backhoe on his head, modified to almost look like an open jaw. Underneath the strange mask, visible light brown hair wildly juts out in random directions, and his eyes are completely covered. He wears denim jeans, boots, and modified gauntlets that leave his fingers exposed, which end in large metal tips. Power loader, Izuku thought, beginning a mental analysis of the pro hero. His quirk mutated his fingers to end in iron. Tipped claws, similar to an excavator. Obvious uses include ease when digging, and more durable fingertips, useful for the manufacturing process. Izuku focused his attention on the shirtless hero, who tapped on the microphone with one of his iron fingertips and began to speak. Welcome to the support course entrance exam. Power loader speaks, his voice gravelly, but still carrying through the speakers well. I'm not one to waste time, so why don't we get down to it? Pulling out a small remote, Power loader turns on the screen behind him, displaying an itinerary for the exam. The written exam consists of two parts, the written exam and the practical exam. He moves in front of the podium, picking up the microphone and carrying it with him. The written exam is 100 questions. There will be no curve, so do not anticipate one. You will have 2 hours to complete the exam. If you finish early, you can turn the test in up front. Power loader then gestured to the screen again. The practical will consist of 2 parts. You will all be given a prompt. In context, it will be phrased as a request from a pro hero to solve a problem. Everyone's prompt will be different, so don't even think about cheating off of each other. Even though his eyes were not visible, Izuku could feel his glare through his mask as he swiped his gaze across the room. Once you have your prompt, you will be given 1 hour to draft a design for a support item that solves that problem. The device can be whatever you want it to be, however expensive you feel is necessary. Whatever works, so long as you stay within the time limit. Power loader clicked a button on the remote. Once that is done, you will each be called in individually to interview with myself and present your design, where you will be asked to explain it. Your score will reflect on how well you do at your task. In addition, there will also be the time where you may present some work you have brought from home. This is the only chance you will have to show your portfolio, so to speak, so don't waste it. The pro hero turned around, turning off the machine. That will be all. The exam starts when you all have your papers. Do not start working until the signal light turns green. Power loader turns back around, his visible mouth forming a vicious, toothy grin. Oh, and I should mention that I have been around for years. I have seen many projects come through this test, so don't think it'll be easy to impress me. He turns and begins walking away, waving his clawed hand at the now visibly anxious students. Good luck, Waltz. You're going to need it. The written exam was exhausting, but rewarding. Each question pushed Izuku to the limits of his academic and technical knowledge. Izuku had just barely managed to review his questions before the buzzer went off and pins went down. After turning in his test, he was led out of the testing hall by an ectoplasm clone towards the rows of rooms in the outer hall. He is directed into one of the rooms, where he sees a fairly simple workshop classroom layout. The desks were large and were already equipped with drafting paper and pencils, as well as some other tools in the base of the desk. Looking to the outer parts of the classroom, Izuku noted large bay doors, likely leading out of UA. In addition, he noticed several welding booths, a forge, threading machines, lathe, and several other machines that he could barely recognize. Everything an aspiring inventor would need. Looking around, he saw most of the seats were already taken, though he did notice that strange girl from earlier looking around the classroom in wonder, seemingly unaware of anyone else even being in the room. Izuku took his seat at one of the last remaining desks and turned his attention forward, waiting for instructions. After some time, the doors to the hall automatically closed, and the ectoplasm clone spoke for the first time. On each desk is a small envelope that contains your prompt. You will have 1 hour to draft a prototype. Be aware of your time limit, as we will not accept half-finished ideas. The clone looks up at the clock. Your time begins now. The clone looks down towards the class, his eyes unblinking as he watches the class. Izuku immediately grabs the envelope and opens it, taking in the prompt. My quirk is a long-range emitter-type quirk that allows me to deal more damage to opponents the further away they are from my body. However, if somebody is close to me, my quirk does not work. I need an item that prevents people from getting close to me, and I need it as soon as humanly possible. Okay, Izuku thinks to himself. I don't have a lot of time to plan this one. This is a tough question. How do you reliably keep your distance from enemies? The easy answer is a jetpack of sorts, but that's basic, not to mention it isn't foolproof. What if the enemy can fly? What if they have extendable limbs? Izuku scratches his head before glancing around the classroom, seeing that the vast majority of the class has already started drafting projects on the provided paper. He panics and rereads the question again. How are they already drafting? We just got the prompts a minute ago. Izuku's heart begins to race. Do they already have solutions to these issues? Are they already so sure of themselves? He takes a deep breath, looking back down at the prompt. Okay, how do you keep your distance in these situations? Already ruled out jetpack. So what about directional gear? Extendable arms that latch onto objects and let you move using them? No, that only really works in a city. In a field, you would only be lugging around more gear. Izuku begins to sweat and looks up at the clock. 10 minutes have already gone by. How? Izuku picks up the pencil, looking down at the drafting paper, but then notices something that makes his blood turn to ice. They only gave us 1 sheet of drafting paper. His hands begin to shake and his ears begin to ring. 1 sheet of paper. 1 chance. We only get 1 chance to do this, but why? People redo their work all the time? Why would they only give us 1 paper? The seconds ticking by are deafening, and Izuku feels the room closing in on him. I'm wasting time. I can't do this. I have nothing. No plan, no idea, nothing that works in this scenario. Tears begin to prick against his eyes, and he feels a dizzying weight settle on his shoulders. He doesn't dare look back up at the clock, but he senses people already getting up around him and handing in their completed designs. They're already done? But I haven't even started yet. Izuku looks around in a panic, seeing that half the class had already left the room, their designs piled on the desk in front of ectoplasm. I can't keep up. I can't keep pace. Finally braving a glance at the clock, he notes that 15 minutes have already passed. A quarter of the time limit gone, and I haven't even come up with a single idea. I can't do this. Why? Why am I always so useless? He puts his head down on the desk, trying to collect himself. I don't know what to do. Izuku looks up and notices that of the 30 people who started in the classroom, only 5 remained. I lost before I even started. The others were all so confident in themselves, in their inventions. And here I am lost. I'm done. He looks up at the ceiling, taking in what might be his last look at the classroom. So close to my dream, so close, and yet I guess this is how far I go. I have nothing, no plan, no solution, no time. He glances over at the side of the room, the clock. Ticking by. 20 minutes had passed, and he had no idea what to do next. But then he notices something. That strange girl from before. She hasn't even picked up her pencil yet. Did she give up too? No, looking at her face, she was deep in thought, mind alive with ideas. She was planning. At this very moment she was still planning, unaware or uncaring of her surroundings. She hasn't even started, and yet she still seems so confident. How? Izuku faces back to his paper, reading the prompt over again. More than a third of the time has passed, and she hasn't even drawn a single line. What does she know that I don't? Is there some trick to this? Some secret right answer? What am I missing that everyone else knows? That she knows? Izuku looks at the paper again, mind spinning. I don't know what I'm missing. I can't begin to understand. What did I miss? Why can't I work under pressure? But I did, didn't I? He looks down at his right arm, still covered by his sleeve. Our device is from home. That's it. Izuku picks up the pencil, holding it up. This isn't a test of our technical expertise at all. That's a red herring. That is what we show with the projects we brought from home. His mind wanders back to Power Loader's initial opening speech. The device can be whatever you want it to be, however expensive you feel is necessary. He thinks back to the prompt. I need it as soon as humanly possible. This is a test of our capabilities. Coming up with a design for an item that you can feasibly make in a rush. This is a test of confidence in our ability to think under pressure. He looks down at his arm again. A test I can definitely pass. He picks up his pencil, looking down at the paper, and begins to think. Okay, we need something quick, easy, and effective. It doesn't need to be fancy. It doesn't need to be elaborate. All it needs to do is solve the problem with the minimal amount of complications. The jetpack, again, is only effective some of the time. So we move back to the initial question. How do you keep your distance in any situation? Unless that isn't the question. Instead, what if we can keep them away from you? Izuku's pencil touched his paper, and he began to draw. Midoriya, you're up next. Izuku clutches his draft to his chest, walking forward into the next room. Turning through the door, he enters the room to find a large office. Papers are messily strewn about the room, filing cabinets full of refuse and blueprints. Izuku notes a corkboard at the far end of the room, filled with detailed designs and ideas for support items. In the center of the room, a space was cleared, and next to the center was a corkboard set up on a tripod. At his desk, Power Loader sits patiently, an oblong helmet still on his head. All right, Midoriya. Power Loader starts, gesturing for Izuku to stand in the center of the room. Let's run through the basics. You graduated from an online school, and your father was a support tech. Power Loader pauses, and you're quirkless, correct? Of course he points that out. Izuku thinks, that is correct, sir. Power Loader doesn't speak for a moment, before looking up at Izuku. All right, let's hear your prompt. I was asked to provide a support item for a hero with a long-range quirk that gets weaker as people get closer. The hero also requested that the device be done as soon as humanly possible. Izuku hands Power Loader the envelope, and he swears that he can see a slight smirk. Given the nature of the device and the time constraint presented by the test and the requester, I chose to avoid complex machinery as a solution. Izuku held up his drafting paper. Instead, I chose to keep the device simple, something that is broad and versatile, that could be used in multiple different scenarios with relatively constant success. Izuku pinned his drafting paper to the board behind him. I designed a concussive force grenade, which when detonated releases a shockwave designed to push a target back, knocking them over if at all possible. Izuku continued, pointing at different parts of the design. The actual filler of the grenade is not explosive in nature. Instead, it is entirely kinetic, designed to produce force without leaving lasting harm. Izuku can feel himself sweating, but his focus is on his presentation right now. When the trigger cap is struck by the pin, it activates an electromagnet within the grenade shell that sends 24 steel balls shooting into each other. When the steel balls collide in the center of the grenade, the collision in the center of the grenade creates small shock waves that are then amplified by the electromagnet until it has nowhere to go but out. At this point, the invisible seam along the middle of the grenade will open, allowing the force to escape and creating a concussive wave with enough force to knock someone back. Izuku turns back to look at Power Loader, who has not moved from his position at the desk. After some time, he nods. I see. Now tell me about the device you brought from home. Izuku felt his body turn cold. Why didn't he say anything about the idea? Was it not good enough? Izuku shakes himself out of his stupor, mentally slapping himself. This is not the time to be overthinking. Just keep presenting. The device I brought from home is a working prosthetic arm with full motion capabilities. The design uses a full neural interface paired to a motion sensor equipped with a fisheye lens to provide motion as imputed directly from the nervous system. Izuku stares straight ahead, not looking at Power Loader, and he slowly takes off his jacket. The design allows for complete nullification of input delay of the limb. Instead, the wiring directly connects to the main nerve body, functioning as an extension of the nervous system itself. Izuku lets the jacket fall off his shoulders, letting Power Loader look directly at his mechanical arm. Power Loader immediately shoots up from his chair, his mouth visibly falling open in shock and some degree of horror. Midoriya, Power Loader starts nervously. Are you telling me that you connected this directly to your nervous system? Izuku nods, refusing to look at Power Loader. That is incredibly reckless, kid. Power Loader sits back down, facing directly towards Izuku's right arm. If you had messed that up at all, you could have died, and you are telling me you did that all by yourself? Yes, Power Loader, sir. Frankly, kid, I don't believe you. Izuku felt his heart sink. It's nothing against you, but I just don't see a way you could have done that yourself, let alone with so little experience. He shakes his head. If you're going to lie, you should at least make it somewhat realistic. Izuku quaked with rage before looking up at Power Loader. Or, of course, he didn't believe him. Nobody ever did. In one sentence, the hero had tried to invalidate the past 9 months of his life. Not to mention the entire experience of installing the damn thing in the first place. So you just assume I came here, lied about my invention, and then lied directly to you? You really think I would be that stupid? If Power Loader felt intimidated, he did not show it. Instead, he simply leaned forward on his desk, masked face seeming to shoot daggers through Midoriya. Honestly? Yes. People do it all the time. They think they can get that kind of thing past me, but it hasn't worked yet, and it won't work now. The hero sighed, turning away from the boy. The whole concept of a 1:1 interface between man and machine is still theoretical, maybe even impossible. I just don't see how a 15-year-old kid could have succeeded where thousands of others have failed. Izuku's fists clenched at his sides, quaking with rage, because none of them ever had the motivation to do what had to be done. A 1-to-1 integration isn't impossible, and I'm living proof. He pulled a small thumb drive out of his pocket and flicked it over to Power Loader, where it landed on his desk. Here is the dictation of the 9-month-long process. There are several hundred audio files. He slams his hand down on the desk, leaving the driver sitting there. The proof is all there, but it seems like you already made up your mind about me. He stalks out the door, ignoring Power Loader's cry that the presentation isn't done yet, and stalks out the door. If he still chooses not to believe me, then it was never meant to be, and I never stood a chance. But I lived through that, and I'm not about to sit there and have him tell me that it was impossible. I know the truth, damn it. Izuku finds his way out of the school and begins walking towards the station, not noticing 2 crosshair eyes watching him walk away. Well, I'll be damned, Majima thought to himself. The kid really wasn't lying. Higuri Majima, better known as Power Loader, sat in his office, playing the audio recordings off the thumb drive. He was pleasantly surprised at how detailed they were, though the most recent edition made him immensely uncomfortable. Listening to the sounds of metal cutting through bone and flesh being drilled into and scorched was unpleasant. Listening to the kids' screams had been bad. Listening to when they stopped, the empty air and slow scorching sounds of the shoulder harness as he cauterized it into place, that was almost worse. Majima had never been good with blood and gore, and the audio of this process, despite only being about 3 minutes, made him sick to his stomach. But it did prove the kid had done it all himself. There was no sign of any aid in any of the dictations. No sign of anyone at all, actually. Did this kid not have parents? Either way, he would have to review the dictations more in depth just to be sure. But given the few hours he had skimmed through, the process is sound, the steps make sense. But that's not the only thing that's impressive. Majima looked up at the board again. The design for the force grenade still displayed on the quirk. The kid not only produced a good design, he paid attention to the actual test. Majima's face slowly split into a shaky grin. Very impressive, Midoriya. Thank you for joining us on this journey through what if Genius Deku challenged the world without a quirk. We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to JayDeeKay for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on archiveofourown.org for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.